live in 3 minutes because it's 10:57 and the official start time for Do the Work is 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Central Time. And by the way, if I just skip that middle identifier, then I can avoid the entire Crozier context 1000%. He really can't come in and try to tell me whether it is standard time or who knows what other options he wants to.
It's standard time right now.
EDT, daylight time, standard
it's
time.
It's EST, CST right now. The DT's right. In the summer. Yeah.
But if I just abbreviate and cut a little bit off of the end of that, then I save some time and I can just say Central or Eastern, and everyone just understands without any kind of confusion. It's almost like there's value in being brief. And
I love how we're trying to preempt Crozier from like actually causing problems, and he doesn't even show up anymore. That's the best part.
Well, no, he doesn't show up in the live broadcast. He just slides into the messages all the time with very complicated questions, and so that's his new motif. That's his new model. The ethos of the Crozier.
I wonder how many people are texting him going, you're being talked about right now.
Well, it could only be like 3 people who could do it because
there's only 3 people.
A, have to be watching the show. B, know Edwin, know that we're messing with him because we like him. All those things have to be. Well, I'm messing
with Crozier.
Yeah. So here's a question for you real quick. It's not like our regular questions. Well, it kind of is. But if you could wake up tomorrow and find out that you have written a book complete, like you don't have to do any of the whatever, what would the book be about? You just wake up tomorrow, book's done. It's even done to your graphic standards.
Like, is this you're expecting me to have like a real thought here, or like something silly like remembering the 2021 Tennessee National Championship? Like, which one is it? Because that's the book I wish I could write.
It's about mood. Like you told me I was in the mood earlier this morning. So it's really trying to delve deep into your emotional experience right now and see
how to find a better coworker to do a podcast with. That would be a book.
Good luck with that. Labor market's pretty scarce right now.
I know, especially for what we're paying on this show.
I know.
The book that I've toyed around with writing is a book about shepherding and evangelism. Like for a serious answer, I think there needs more material out there about how evangelists and shepherds work together, both from a scriptural and practical way. That actually, just to be quite frank, because we talked about a lot on this broadcast, that avoids all the, but wait, here's the slippery slopes, and here's the tradition, and here's how we have to do this now, and just gets like pulls back the covers and goes, this is actually what makes sense according to the scriptures. I think that's lacking. I think there's and a book about the Holy Spirit, but I wouldn't put my name on the book about the Holy Spirit because I still need to provide for my family. So.
Let me just get my space here.
That's why I tell people, they're like, you should write a book about a workbook on the Holy Spirit. I was like, yeah, but I'd like to hold gospel meetings and work and so forth.
Yeah, well, you just saying it online is enough for some people to decide just to brand you as the heretic you already are and be done.
Yeah, there's some people who are like, we need to have him in a meeting about the Holy Spirit. So.
Yeah, well, let's just get it on record. Let's get it on tape. We'll put it live.
Well, no.
I got a whole slate of titles, but they could be like any subject. Like We Can Have Both is a great title.
I mean, let's all say this: we're waiting for your smoked meat cookbook. That's what needs to come out.
It's a slow process. Barbecue and theology.
Burnt offerings. Burnt offerings of the pork kind.
Yeah. Like the level of dad puns that would be potential in that environment is significant.
Yeah.
The problem is I know too many publishers who probably would be like, yeah, let's go ahead and do that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll sell.
I don't see any issues here. What's the issue?
Yeah. 100%. You know,
Yeah.
it doesn't even have to be like that good. Like if it's got good artwork, it'll sell. If it's a coffee table book, it'd probably sell more than for the look than the content.
Yeah.
Anyway,
speaking of smoked meat, let's talk about trimming the fat.
Yeah, no, it's like the level of, what am I making the cut here? We've got. So
we're
for
talking
today,
Segway Central today, baby.
That's right. We're going to just talk a little bit about taking all the various good ideas that come up in the process of developing a sermon for a Sunday, a class, for another environment. And Lopez is sliding in with burnt ends and burnt offerings. You are right in our space, and we'll have to get together and talk later. By the way, bacon burnt ends, I've had them before. I'm going to make them again soon. Excellent little offering. Anyway, it's a great kind of a North Texas thing.
Focus.
We're talking about this concept of for preaching, and we're putting together your thoughts, your ideas, and you end up with this huge basket of great ideas. That's kind of how you, no matter what you're doing, whether you're reading ahead, whether you're examining, a subject in the text, you're paying context and narrative, you take all your various notes about it. At some point, you've got to take your 3, 4, 5, 10, 12, 18 hours of research and reading and figure out, how am I going to fit it into my assigned speaking space?
By the way, this is, and I don't want to get into the debate about scheduling, not scheduling, but I think this gets harder if you schedule out because you're thinking literally for weeks about what's coming up.
Yeah.
And every time you read a blog or you hear a podcast or you get in a discussion, you're like, oh, and then you go like, I've got a journal and I go and journal things down. And then when it comes time to actually get this into an outline, you're like, wow, what have I got going on here? And that's the benefit. It's the blessing and the curse of the looking ahead kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's just interesting to kind of point that out, that the more time you give yourself to plan, the harder it is to cut down the fat off of the sermon. And by the way, before we go further, Phil, I want to say this. This is not about, when we talk about cutting down your sermon, I don't want you to think this is about hitting a pre-prescribed mark of time for your church. Like, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about taking something, because this could work two ways, Phil. Like, I've heard sermons, you've heard sermons where there was a lot of fat because the guy was expected to talk about this subject for 35 minutes and he could have done it in 27.
Yeah.
And in that situation, you find yourself in that situation, you're better to end early than to put all this fat on the sermon. And
right. And there's a sense of, it's got to be this way that produces that outcome. And you phrased it, I've heard, I've seen. I'll just go one more step and say, I've done. Like,
we've all done it.
Done that.
Yeah.
Because we thought we had to, or we were asked to. Like, those two things exist. So here's something that has to go with this. When you're trimming fat, and you're going to trim fat out of sermons, we'll talk about some of the what, when, why in just a second. You need to create a place where you can take those really good ideas, and a lot of the stuff you trim out of a sermon is independently good, and save it. And just as a side note, you got to pick a workable system that's functional for you. I do all of that inside the Note app for Apple products. But other people do different things. They might use a journal. They might do a lot of print, handwritten stuff. They might use a folder system. They might have whatever. Before you start the process of cutting the fat, have some place you can retain all those leavings to produce a second value out of. Maybe there's seeds for a great idea in the future. Maybe you keep them on the back end for a Bible class.
Another thing that if you're using Logos is sometimes you can include that as a note within your text of wherever you're at, so that you may not use it this time, but you have it the next time. And that's where using the notes function really helps out for And maybe you don't do that. Maybe use the journaling Bibles like ESV and some CSB, and some of them have the paperback journaling Bibles. You can write it in there, whatever it is. Like, I think one of the things to keep in mind is what you're trimming sometimes has value, Phil. It's just not the best value for the moment. Is I think important.
Right. And so just have some place where you can save it in a functional manner. Those note sections in Logos are really great. One benefit of the notes, by the way, in Logos is you can put them into folders. Those folders can be attached to future sermons, and then an entire note can be formatted right into your next class or your next set of notes. And it brings all of its formatting with it, brings the tags text with it. And so it really kind of doubles down on the efficiency level with, making the most of your material, which is a good old Johnny Edwards, quote that I bring up from time to time. Doing that creates the outcome you're looking for, of saving it so you can reproduce it in the future. So what Terry has already refined for us in part is this is not about hitting a mark in time. That's a separate thing, really important. This is right now thinking about why does, and I'll throw this is similar to what I do. He puts the same concept there that Paul's got there. Why do we do this? Like, what needs to be cut? What brings it to the chopping block, if you will, that says, no, this doesn't belong here. So Terry, I know I've got a couple of things that I use as baseline behaviors to decide if this needs to be here. But what are some of the things that you use to develop that process?
Well, so I think a couple of things. First off, if I've got to choose between, if I'm trying to force an illustration into a sermon somehow because I think it lightens the mood or it's what I want to say, that's one of the first things to cut. If you got to force something in there and you put it in there and you're like, well, that doesn't fit, but I want to do this anyway, that's got to go. Especially because I think one of the things you got to understand is when you think about a piece of meat, okay, one of the lessons I learned not too long ago, you and I talked about this, was the last brisket I smoked, I cut too much fat off of it, which dried out the brisket. And so we're not saying that there doesn't need to be some things added, if I can say it that way, to the scriptural content. But the other problem is if you put too much fat in the brisket and leave too much, it also alters it the other way. And so sometimes illustrations, and as I use the illustration of smoking meat, sometimes that needs to go. And I got to say that I think early on in my preaching, I made two mistakes that would fall into this category. One of those are, I fell into this trap. I think a lot of young preachers do, that you try to make a point and you feel like I need to do a concordance search and use as many passages as possible to support this point. And there may be times, Phil, where you need 4 or 5 passages. This Sunday, I talked about the idea of God's faithfulness, and I used probably 5 or 6 passages in the opening point to show just what this Hebrew word for faithfulness means in different contexts. And there's a value to that. There's not a value to showing 5 passages using that word all in the exact same way. Each passage I use showed different kind of angles of the Hebrew word of met and faithfulness and what that means. And I think what I mean by that is sometimes you can trim a lot of fat off your sermon because you're proof texting with 8 passages. You don't need to proof text first, but 1 or 2 can do the job. You don't need 8 passages to make a point that 1 or 2 can make. So the first thing sometimes you do is, for instance, you don't need to go read every example in the Gospels about a retelling of the story that Jesus makes. There's a lot of stories in there that are recounted 3 or 4 times, and you might pick up some details from another account. One of those is Matthew and Mark use a little bit different language when I talk about Jesus and Peter walking on the water. But I'm going to use Matthew as my text for the sermon, and I'm just going to glance at Mark, and I'm not even going to turn over there and read it. I'm just going to say, now Mark will say this. When I was younger, I would have turned over and read Mark. I would have read all of both passages. That's just not necessary. So that was the first. And the other thing is, I think sometimes when I was younger, I fell into this idea that I had to have a illustration of some kind for every point that I was making. And
Yeah.
that's just not true. I had to have a story. I had to have something funny. I had to have a quote. And I got to tell you, I don't know about you, Phil, but I used to pile a lot of that stuff into my sermons. It's kind of rare these days. There may be one or two illustrations. I'd rather just spend a lot more time just showing what the scriptures provide. And those are two things that immediately come to my mind on my list of things that I would cut. Is if I've got an illustration for every point, I'm actually at my point where I'm at in my preaching, I'm going to go and say, no, we don't need to do that. That's completely unnecessary. So those are the two things that come to mind. I don't know if those are on your list. Maybe they are, but maybe you have a more exhaustive list.
Well, I try to be not. As I've gotten older, I try not to be exhausting if I can.
We all know that you have an Excel
works.
spreadsheet about this, just like you do everything else. So go for it.
So one of the things that it's like primary on the list is making sure that I'm not going to lead the audience down a rabbit hole. If there's a fork in the idea, and one goes back to the main message, and the other one goes down this really interesting, cool, whatever, it needs to be trimmed. Like, it's just that simple. Like,
yeah, if you've got in your notes to say something like, on a side note, take all that out.
Yeah,
we don't need
there are
side
no side
notes.
notes.
Yeah.
There's no asides unless the aside actually bumps a person back to the main point.
Which is rare, because usually that's a squirrel moment. That's what it is.
Right. So that's just like an immediate, like if it's super, and it might be awesome, and it might be this really cool thing that only occurs this one time in the Bible or whatever. Okay, it needs its own thing. It becomes a Facebook post. It becomes a comment somewhere else in a Bible class. It makes the note in the app for future reference. So number one, I got to keep the rabbit holes away. Bible classes and in sermons, especially in sermons.
Right.
And then there's like three things that have to take place that are a little bit more specific. One, I want to make sure that whatever comments I'm including, they're going to meet the need of the message. Like, when I make application of this text, is the thing that I'm saying right now, does it meet that need? Secondly, I have rules about contextual messages. Like, I really want it to have the idea of a compact, powerful thing that someone can remember and talk about at lunch. But it's going to be something that meets the Bible's big picture of Jesus, and that whatever I'm saying, if I'm talking about the gospel, if I'm talking about the kingdom, if I'm talking about Jesus, the disciples, that it's going to meet those basic core rules. And then in the end, it has to really, since it's not that branch to the side, does it actually drive the message itself forward? Is it the next thing that needs to be said? It could be completely biblically accurate, but it's not the thing to say right now. And that includes my illustrations and how I might explain or illustrate a text. It may be the best way to explain it, but and then there's this one last category, and I think it's super important. We are creatures of habit. And for me, I have a loving family that maintains a list of words and phrases that I repeat. And every now and then they complain about them. And so every now and then I say, I need to make sure I don't say those things that way anymore, so that I don't become stale in that regard. But also, this is the other half of it. This is not the time for every sermon to have a hobby horse in it. You just ride and ride and ride. Eventually the audience will tune you out, and that's the last thing you need to have happen. Like, you've just got to get to a point that says, okay, I don't need to talk about this today. It may be important, it may be valuable, but this is not the space.
Yeah, on the rabbit hole thing, I think one of the things is the danger for preachers. We'll come across something we've never seen before, and we think that's really, really cool. But it's also one of those deals where what's cool to us is not cool to everybody else, right? And sometimes the other issue is we may see something that really kind of alters the way we look at things, or maybe we think is really amazing, but that's not something your audience is necessarily ready for. Like, there's some wisdom in knowing sometimes there's conversations that Phil and I may have that we say, hey, have you ever thought about this? But we would never publicly go down that path because of a lot of reasons. That fits in that rabbit hole category you're talking about, Phil. And the hobby horse really can become a rabbit hole too. I mean, it's just a different form of the rabbit hole where you have, we know guys that they, when they preach, they're going to try to circle back to this one thing.
You mean the garden?
Yeah. Which, I mean, frustrating how many times that's true. But at the end of the day, we know certain guys where, hey, this guy's going to get to this, or maybe it's one of these three things. And just don't be that guy. Don't be that guy. I have phrases, and the frustrating thing is those phrases have changed over the years where somebody will tell me, oh, you say this a lot. And I'll purposely change. And then 2 years later, it's a different phrase, Some of that, by the way, is going to come out because that's just how you're going to talk. And when you're preaching, I try to script most words I say, but when I'm preaching, you're going to say things that aren't scripted. And if you have a habit of saying, now I'm going to say, then you're going to add that in even when you don't have it planned. It's just going to happen. So I don't even necessarily think that's as much as the fat necessarily as a habit. But when we think about the fat here, we're really talking about, hey, here's some things. They just don't have any place in the public preaching. I'll tell you another one. Preaching is not the time for you to throw out an idea to think about. What I mean by that is what some people have called shotgun sermons, where you pull the trigger and you don't know where it's going to go. There's like no purpose. If you find yourself preaching like going, I don't know if this what this means, but what do you think about this? That's probably not the place for that. Yeah. And I'm not saying that there can't never be that, but when that comes, we're supposed to speak on truth, not suppositions and not assumptions and not theoretically. We should preach on truth. And I just think that's an issue here as well, not to go down that path. I got a slow clap for that, I think, by the way.
Yeah, we'll have to go ahead and make sure we identify that.
That doesn't happen.
Give Terry some props. He's a little struggling today, so
raise my coffee to that.
Here's something else that kind of fits in this thing. We talked about let's talk a little bit more about the when and the why this is important. Think about the crafting of a message. One of the things I still do that helps me refine this concept is I have created an everyman that represents the community in our local area. And so that's the receiver of the message. The reason why you get to this level of refinement that says, I'm not going to include this or that, is because you are serving as the stained window, if you will, that's going to reveal to your audience the light or image of God. They're going to come through whatever you present to them. And there's nothing you can do about that. You're going to be the less accurate version of whatever you read. So the more effort you put into trimming out the things that don't belong there, you're going to take that heart, that's every man or every person you're kind of focusing in on in your audience. Your goal is to draw them to the cross, is to lead them to the cross. And so you have to be mindful of your own position in that situation, that they can see above, beyond, and through you to see the cross. That's part of the reason why you're going to be precise with what you decide to include. And Terry's comments are spot on with regards to this is not the supposition period. There's great value in pondering the small mysteries of God that aren't really clear on the first read. But in that sermon space, you're serving as a participant in worship. You're not an academic anymore. You're not just a learner. Heaven forbid you're not in this space that says, well, I've done my own research. Well, your research is probably not that very good. Know how good you think it is. You're a conduit between the participants, including you, and God on high. And so you've got to realize, hey, not everything goes here. and that's okay. It's okay to trim this out.
You can do that in class, by the way. I mean, I think in a Bible class is the time to say, here's three different ways to look at this, and here's how I
Yeah,
lean, but and present all three. I think one of the things to do is to be fair there, present all the different sides, try to do it as equally as possible. That's the right space for that. Okay. And for
right,
people to ask questions and to have discussions. But in a sermon, what you're dealing with is something completely different. You're dealing with a time period where you have people that don't necessarily have the physical maturity to handle those kind of things. And let me illustrate that way. I'm not sure that my freshman in high school, as smart as she is biblically mature enough to handle some of the things that we may suggest in Bible class yet. Um, and so that's not even about adults. Remember, and I think when you talk about I'm every man, here's one of the things I tell people a lot of times. You know, the sermon's got to be able, and this is what I try to do. I've got to be able to try to hit the sixth grader and the person who's been a Christian for 50 years in the same message with something. Like that's the hard part. I've got to engage and connect to everybody on different levels of maturity and knowledge, and that's difficult, right? So your every man has a wide age gap and a wide experience gap, whereas and so when I look at, and this is where I think, so there's some things I will tell you that sometimes what you need to do is you need to trim your sermon down so that you can quote fatten it up the right way.
right.
And one of the things I would talk about with areas like I've said before about triads, and D. Bowman was a big guy with this. You know, you take a thing and you may cut out a couple of passages. So in the application phase of whatever point you're making, you can say it in three different ways. You can say the same thing three different ways, but the way you say it is going to hit maybe different genders or different knowledge bases or different maturity bases. And you say something in explanation. And that, by the way, is not fat fill. That's where you actually are able to drive a point home in an effective way. And that's where the 24-year-old Terry Francis, the preacher, who used 8 passages on one subject, was robbing himself of the opportunity to actually make the application effectively.
Right.
By coming out with a way to do that hits more people. And that's, I think, an important part of this.
Right. You know, I've talked about it in terms of stickiness or stick around, if you want to use a different analogy, so that the spear stays in. If it's going to pierce and actually cause the spiritual change you want, it's going to have to be able to hang around long enough in their mind to survive everything that happens from the amen to the lunch table, and everything happens from the lunch table to the afternoon. You know, and you think about, well, that's not that very long. How many micro interactions does a person have after worship that causes their life to kind of spiral out into all these other spaces of responsibility? We can carry a really heavy message to the pulpit and not do a good job of taking the heaviness and letting people carry it in the right way. Um, I really think there, when we get into like this when and why, the trim side of things, we tend to preach in ways that forget that the Lord has the ability to provide for us another Sunday. And so that's part of this. Like, what do we need to carry for right now? Like, what's the right now big thing that's really important? And every Sunday we're asking that same question. What's the really important thing? What are the 2 really important things? What are the 3 really important things? And what's sufficient to fuel us to the next time we worship together?
Because we don't want to go over time on a subject matter that's about, trimming fat. But let me say this.
We got 4 minutes, man.
Yeah. I also think one of the places I can trim fat, I have a lot, is in my introductions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it was the book. What is it? Is it Stand Like Lincoln, Speak Like Churchill, or the other way around? One of the things that book talked about is no more soft openings. And there was a time where we got up and we talked about, we just want to welcome you here. We want to do this, and we ramble on for 5 minutes about little things that, quite frankly, are just a distraction. And especially for where I'm at now, where we're trying to provide this kind of thematic flow to our entire time together, it's actually a disconnect and a distraction for me to get up and make an announcement. Now, there's times I have to do that. But as a general rule, I get up, I'm not welcoming guests anymore. We've already done that. I'm going to go right into the message, and my introduction's not going to be very lengthy. I mean, Phil, I know before I've done 7-8 minute introductions. If I go 5 minutes on an introduction now, that's too much meat, or too much fluff. I don't need all of that. Hey, here's why we're going to talk about this. Let's get into what we're talking about.
Yep.
My moments are precious anyway, and I don't want to spend it on stuff that that doesn't matter. I mean, and again, I think I gain an advantage here that our entire time together has been leading up to what we're going to talk about. So I've had songs and prayers and even the Lord's Supper most Sunday mornings that are all an introduction and a call to worship that says, here's what we're talking about today. I have all of that. That's kind of got our mindset. And for me to stop and tell a joke about the other day when I was driving with my family and it's out of place, and it doesn't need to happen. It's a waste of time, and it's a disconnect. So I would say, look at your introductions. If you start getting into these introductions that are really fluffy and really more about trying to draw somebody in, cut that stuff out. Like, part of that goes to that I'm looking at Corinthians, and I've really looked a lot at what Paul said about, I didn't come with eloquent words. And I mean, I'm not saying we should purposely be a bad speaker, but this is not a performance. We're getting into the message.
Open your Bible, let's read together is a sufficient introduction for some subjects.
Yeah.
So with all that being said, this is given like a little kind of a starter package of doing this. And it's something that you can develop into a habit. You can build within you the habit. There's a great little app I use a lot to kind of reduce and increase clarity. It's the Hemingway app. And I'll take stuff in there and I'll throw it in there. And that app fixes grammar a little bit, but primarily it's designed to make your sentences and your statements shorter and more forward-looking. Grammarly is a good way to help with this too. It can also help you trim some of that language fat. But there's lots of other great resources. But that's it for our time today. We want to thank everyone for joining in our conversation. If you've got extra questions, reach out. We're happy to help.